Yes, thank you for the privilege. Magriet, I've heard so many good things about you, and your name pop up everywhere, and all the meetings, then you're there, and I've never met you in person, but I know your name very well. And Marie studied and taught in the field, Magriet studied and taught in the field of theology. And then she took up a position as a Faculty of Theology's Blended Learning Coordinator. That's when I became aware of you. And later that of the Academic Development Coordinator. She is currently the Learning Technologies Advisor at CLT and provides support for the institutional use of ICTs in the learning and teaching. She is pursuing a doctoral studies in theology, focusing on the concepts of thinking and judgment in the work of German political thinker Hannah Arendt. So then you think of Hannah Arendt and then you think of ICTs. Her teaching and research interests center on pedagogy of discomfort, academic development strategies, instructional and learning design, and blended and hybrid learning. So it's a mouthful, Magriet, and sometimes you're torn. And I wanted to first one day speak to you after a meeting, and you just said from the one meeting you're going to the next meeting. So thank you for your time and being willing to be part of Research Week. I know you have a full and busy work days. So thank you again, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Madeleine. I know we write our own bios, but every time someone reads it out loud, it's such a shock to hear also what one is doing. You often forget that, and in the spaces we are currently inhabiting. So it's nice to be reminded of that. And as you also heard, I myself am a struggling researcher. As you know, I've been studying for quite a while, and I'm trying to juggle full-time work with PhD as well. So people ask, how is Hannah Arendt and the concept of critical thinking and judgment, what does it have to do with my everyday job? Well, it has everything to do with my everyday job, because we are all, as researchers, all as academics, all as people who are interested in teaching and learning, we all have to think about critical thinking and judgment, and that includes the tools that we use, such as Turnitin. So Madeleine, I'm also very grateful to you for inviting me. I am a Turnitin nerd at heart, and I use Turnitin regularly. I've used it daily in my work in the last 7 years, working with students as well as lecturers and researchers, and using this tool specifically. So I'm by no means an expert, but I am a keen and avid reader of the works and the discussions, and I have a keen interest. So I'm hoping that today I can give you some insights from my own personal experience, be very practical as far as I can, and then also have time for questions, and where possible to be able to answer your questions as effectively as I can. Right, so colleagues, I'm going to keep my camera on if that's okay with you. Kishna, do you prefer if I switch my camera off for bandwidth?
No, usually that's up to the presenter. If you want to keep your camera on, it's also fine.
Okay, great. So if at any time you are struggling to follow or to see because of bandwidth, please let Kishna know in the chat, and I will then also switch off my camera. But it's just nice in this day and age to see the person, as Madeleine said. Actually, Madeleine, we met each other once, but it was outside at a pizza place, and it was dark. So we have met at least in person once. So just to reiterate, my name is Magriet de Villiers. I am a Turnitin nerd, and I am an advisor in learning technologies at the Center for Learning and Teaching, Center for Learning Technologies, and we fall under the Division of Learning Technologies Enhancement, and this includes also the Center for Learning and Teaching and student support. But I mostly work at this stage with lecturers, and when I work with, I used to work quite a lot with students regarding Turnitin. What is a similarity index? How do you use it effectively? How do you interpret it? How do you interpret it effectively? But lately I've been getting a lot of the same queries from researchers. So people as myself, as a PhD student or a master's student, or people who have been publishing for years, who are now expected to make use of what we call plagiarism detection mechanisms, such as Turnitin, when they need to publish. So a lot of what I'm going to touch upon today are things that we could discuss with students as well. So there are across the board discussions taking place worldwide on this theme. So I just want to check as well, can you see the slides clearly on your side, Kishna?
Yes, we can.
Perfect, thank you. Right, so we are going to just quickly, and as you can see, it's going to be quite full. We are going to look at 3 specific things. We can't start this discussion without looking at the concept of plagiarism, academic integrity, and the nitty-gritty of what that means for us. Then we're going to look a bit at Turnitin and the failings and the merits of the tool, because it is a tool. We're going to look a little bit at how to interpret your report. I'm going to give you some static examples, and then I'm going to open up one of my own pieces of work that I've submitted through a Turnitin Sandbox, and I will also show you how to create one if you have a training course, and then there will hopefully be some time for questions. So, as I said, we have to get started with the discussion on plagiarism and academic integrity, because you can't talk about something like Turnitin or any other plagiarism detection mechanism without talking about what is plagiarism and what is academic integrity, and how those two are intricately and intimately woven together. So we as an institution are held to a certain standard of excellence, but I also think it's an international standard. Now, there are a lot of discussions about what the standard of excellence means for global north, global south, who decides this. We're not going to get into that today, but we hold ourselves up to these standards of excellence when it comes to plagiarism and academic integrity and the type of work that we produce at the university. And this includes students as well as staff members. And we see this in our policies and regulations as well. So this policy on plagiarism and support of academic integrity is the most current guideline and policy that we have at the university. We are reviewing it as of this year. And you can see that when talking about plagiarism and academic integrity, we often talk about all of the catchy phrases: cheating, stealing, dishonesty, etc. But what it comes down to is an ethical way of working with your resources and in your research. And it's about honesty and transparency when you are doing any academic activity at the university, but also your research. So being honest about whose work you are using, being transparent that it's not your idea, and then also that staff and students, we are obligated to act ethically in the best interest of our university, but also in the best interest of ourselves. So I, as a PhD, researcher, I'm very cognizant of the fact that my reputation is also, at risk as an academic if I am not constantly asking myself, am I honestly and transparently and ethically doing my research and using my resources and my sources? So we know that plagiarism has to do with misappropriating sources, using them or giving the impression that all of the ideas that you have in your work is solely your own, and therefore you do not need to use referencing properly because you are a genius. But the fact of the matter is that plagiarism is not as clear-cut as simply as that. Academic integrity is not as clear-cut, so we need a nuanced and a very critical approach. And as researchers, we need to be very nuanced and critical to ourselves in the way in which we do our research. So none of us is born out of a vacuum. And unfortunately, this is true. Nothing is new. Nothing under the sun is new. And everything that we're working on, and that's why we have these wonderful libraries and these wonderful resources, and tools such as Turnitin. And we'll talk about the database and how wonderful that can be to get new resources. But just to say that, we are exposed in the way in which we do our work. And this is important because we need foundations for our work. So we are, by essence, exposed to other people's work, to other people's ideas, whether that be our peers, close to us, those whom we are reading and therefore are in discussion with, be they long dead or still alive. And when we are engaging with those resources and those sources, we need to kind of go into that mindset of knowing that although we are using their sources, it is expected of us to bring something to the table that is yours as a researcher. Now, take note of the word original inputs, or synthesis and syntheses. I'm always quite skeptical of the word original, because original can be quite a scary idea. Especially so in humanities, we can often say, oh, but I'm really making a big stride in the philosophy of Hannah Arendt, for instance. That would be a small miracle. But in environments such as science, mathematics, or STEM environments, this idea of original is quite difficult because you're bringing something small to the table, but that is based on a lot of work and research that has to be done. So we need to say that we are aware that we are using these sources, and that when we say original, we in essence mean that I am giving credit to those whom I use, but I am bringing my own flavor to that, whether that be the context that I bring, whether that be one small change in phrase that I bring, whether that be one comma that I bring. But it also has to do then with self-plagiarism. Now that is a swear word wherever we go, because self-plagiarism is so difficult for us as researchers, students as well, undergrad students, but postgraduate, because we are constantly conversing with these sources, and their words, their ideas become part of who we are as researchers, right? So often your ideas, and they should become intermingled with this world of information that you've accessed and cultivated over the years. So the term self-plagiarism, and often this is an issue for lecturers or researchers who have worked for many years, saying, but this is the work I created, albeit in 1998, but this was my work. But there is still this expectation that you are, giving this piece of work as a new work that you've now worked on. You're getting funding for it. You're getting credit for it. So people say, self-plagiarism is an act of misleading. Well, yes. If you are constantly using the same concept over and over again, the same metaphors over and over again, giving the idea that this is brand spanking new work that you've done, and you should get credit for it, you should get funding for it, and then that is misleading. But because we are also working in fields where we need to build knowledge as we go along, and we therefore also publish in these cycles, we should rather think of it as text recycling. So I like that word, saying we state clearly that we are building on our previous arguments, that we are building on work that we've done previously. Some of it may be similar, and that's why we do self-reference, even though it's one of the most uncomfortable things to do. But because we also in that way show what we have already contributed to the world in which we are engaging. So this brings us to Turnitin. Because as we are in this big, internet of things, and we have access to so many information sources, and people have access to things that we, have created in jest on Twitter, etc., etc. Turnitin was created out of the idea that dishonest practices were on the rise, and there is still this idea that dishonest practices in academia are on the rise. Now, I'm a bit skeptical of saying that it's on the rise, because it's always been prevalent. We know that. But so Turnitin came about as a technological tool and a technical tool to kind of fill that gap. People saying, well, you now have access to all of this information. We need to ensure that people use it responsibly. But the tool itself, Turnitin, has its failings and its merits. And it's important that we know both of them. And I'm just going to touch upon a very few because our time is limited. But it's important that we know what the failings are as well as the merits are, because when we engage with the tool and therefore through the tool with our research, we need to be cognizant of them so that we ensure that we are not perpetuating academic dishonesty, that our research practices are ethical and still on point, and still, work well for the environments in which we are studying or researching. So let's start off with the failings. So we need to be very, very cognizant, and this is something that I am one day going to have tattooed somewhere or other, because Turnitin is not a plagiarism tool. It falls under the plagiarism detection mechanisms. That's what we call this blanket statement of these technological tools, but it doesn't, as a tool, detect plagiarism. This is very important for us as researchers to understand. What then detects plagiarism? Well, the person reading and interpreting the report, whether that be your supervisor, whether that be yourself, because hopefully you read and interpret your own reports as you go along, and also then publishers or the university when your PhD or your master's thesis is then accepted. So it checks for originality and similarity in comparison to other works out there, but it is in itself not a fail-proof or foolproof plagiarism detector. Right, so just to give you an example, this is an example from a student I worked with who came from another university and did her master's at that other university. Everything is above board, nothing wrong with that. Came to our university and did an extension of that master's through her PhD work. Okay, very clearly put in her text that she is basing a lot of her ideas on her already accepted and at that stage published masters. Right. So when we see a similarity score or a match overview, as it's called, like this, of 69, immediately everyone freaks out. The lecturer says, or the supervisor says, I'm not even going to read it because it's too high. Okay. But the fact is that 69 in essence means nothing or says nothing about plagiarism until you as a human being go and read and analyze that report. And I'll show you a little bit about how in depth you can analyze a report. So what does that 69 mean? Well, in this case, it means that 69% of this person's work is deemed by this tool to be similar than other people's work. And in this case, it was 62% of her previous work. We did bring it down. We made sure that she was referencing properly. We made sure that there was no inherent duplication of the main general work, that her PhD focus was still very unique, but she needed to make use of her previous work to build on her PhD thesis. So looking simply at that and looking at the colors, we'll look a little bit at colors as well, means nothing, okay, until we read it ourselves, until we go through it as people. We determine whether it's plagiarism or not. We being also the systems that we use, the policies and guidelines, and then also the, let's say, for instance, the disciplinary guidelines we use that determine whether it is plagiarism or not. So it's really not fail-proof. It's based on an algorithm. For anyone who's ever wondered how it works, it's quite an intricate algorithm that is constantly updated. In essence, it kind of checks, in very layman's terms, the zeros and the ones of your text. So as you know, everything that is text-based and electronic is made up of ones and zeros, and then created in this wonderful way in which we can actually see it and understand it. So it's based on an algorithm that works through these texts to find the originality and the similarity. But then it's also based on user settings. So the user settings takes place on two levels. One is the institutional settings. So when you purchase a license, such as Stellenbosch University has done from Turnitin, we also have parameters which we set of what is, what is going to be searched for originality. But then also when you have a lecturer or a supervisor who sets up a Turnitin link or a sandbox, there are settings in there that are set up so that you can decide, do you want to filter small words and small matches, or would you rather not filter anything? So it's not fail-proof, and what you in the end also see, let's say that 69, may also depend on, did the algorithm work, or is it giving us false positives, or sometimes even false negatives? And what were the settings used to set up this link? Then also there are discussions going on about the validity of Turnitin being used in the higher education environment and in publishing and research in general. So this was a very limited study, very small study done by Dr. Susan Schoen of the University of Texas, Austin. And she did this in 2007 and then replicated the test of Turnitin again in 2015 within her university, where it came down to it that Turnitin found 40% of the sources, only 16% were partially found, and then 44% of the sources that were used were not picked up. So what she found in this very limited, and I must say that that's important, is that sometimes this algorithm and the user settings doesn't work optimally. And there may be cases where you get a false positive, so where something seems extremely high in unoriginality, so the similarity is very high. Yet when you go and look at it, it's about interpretation, or it's false negative. Student gets a very low similarity score, although they may be using their own work again, but simply because the algorithm does not have access to that, let's call it the main source. So there are concerns about the validity of the findings, and we need to take that into account, because it means that when we do use the tool for the merits that it brings to the table, we have to be open and critical and aware. And then to add to that, some lecturers and institutions won't use Turnitin or any other tools for various reasons, including the fact that it becomes the property of Turnitin and they're creating their own little niche technological field. And some researchers prefer not to use Turnitin because they don't want their material on this database, where it can potentially also, somewhere down the line, be used against them inappropriately, where someone may think it's plagiarism or academic dishonesty, but is not. But the merits are also there for us to take note of. So this is a local article by our colleagues at Rhodes University, Amanda Mpahlele and Sue McKenna, where they did a study of Turnitin use in higher education. And one of its strong points, and this is important for us, is that Turnitin can be a pedagogical tool. In other words, it helps us to constructively think as researchers, how am I working with my resources? How am I working with my sources? Perhaps the way in which I do research, reading, taking notes, perhaps that in itself is not working. So I might not be paraphrasing enough. I might not be thinking enough and embedding that information enough to paraphrase it effectively. So although one could argue that, well, okay, so it could be a pedagogical tool for researchers and students to better themselves and to develop a manner of writing that is appropriate. You could also say, well, it can also be used then, quite rightly, for people to find ways to circumvent the system. So I'm going to put it through Turnitin multiple times. I'm going to find what it picks up, and then I'm just going to throw a few synonyms in there. And it does happen like that. But if we are researchers who are really passionate about our contribution to the field and the work which we do, we'll try and use this tool rather to say, okay, I realize now that I might not have a good grasp on this concept, because the way in which I am communicating this is just too similar to the sources. So let me rethink, let me re-embed, let me critically engage with the material again, and then Turnitin becomes a pedagogical tool instead of a circumventing tool and saying, oh, okay, let's look at a few synonyms. In the end, it doesn't make any sense. But also part of its strong points is that it's a great database of information. So one of the ways in which this can also be a great pedagogical tool is that by putting your work through Turnitin, I often get, for instance, articles or references to an article where it's picked up that I've never heard of in my life. But when I look for it and go through the report, I see, okay, this is something that I could use. So it's also building on your own knowledge base and your own resource base. So Turnitin has a global student paper database, so 1.4 billion student papers, and this is from all over the world in different languages, and it's growing day by day, which is of course great for the business model, but also great for us because we are also getting access as researchers to resources we might not have had access to, you know, even in foreign languages that we are not familiar with. They also have the Internet Archive, which is huge, by the way. It doesn't, it even reads websites that are not existent anymore. So it may be that you used a website in 2003 and that you keep on using that website for your resources or as part of your bibliography, but it doesn't exist anymore. But Turnitin will still pick it up and say, okay, you know, this is similar. And right, so it also has a great database of premium scholarly publications. So that's another merit of this tool, is really being able to gate to sources that you might not necessarily have been able to even, you know, find in another way. So right, let's get to interpreting your report. So what should you look for? What do your supervisors, or what should your supervisors look for? And what do publishing houses and journals, what do they look for when they pass your material through Turnitin or a similar system? So taking everything into account about academic integrity, reputational risk, being an ethical researcher who's passionate about your research field, what do you then do when you get your Turnitin report? So I'm going to ask of you that if you do have a Turnitin report that you could open next to you right now, that would be great, just to give yourself something to work with, but it's also not extremely necessary. So just a few things that we need to take into account. We said that Turnitin is not fail-proof. It works and is based on an algorithm and based on user settings on structural and individual level. So it may pick up certain aspects that we know are false positives. So in other words, it picks up something that we know is not plagiarism. And one of these is, for instance, your name. So if you have a history of, as a student also, of submitting to Turnitin through the university, then it will, in all probability, pick up your name or your email address or the name of the university. In this case, you'll see that it picked up 2015 because, yes, a lot of people are submitting work with the date 2015 on it. But we know that this is not plagiarism. This is, in fact, a false positive. But we know that by picking this up, that the algorithm is at least doing its job. It is picking up dominant words and dominant phrases that are very often used. The same goes for table of contents. So remember that it also, if a student is submitting it in a class, for instance, then it will also match the student's work, the submitting student's work to their classmates' work. So in this case, if you have received a draft, a brief to create the following assessment or assignment with the following, headings, then the chances are pretty good that your table of contents is going to look similar to someone else in your class. If you are researching something that is a quite structured research project and you are going through a very formulaic structured approach, then the chances are that your table of contents might also become a false positive and be highlighted in the Turnitin similarity reports because the phrases you are using are similar, the terms you are using are similar. Okay. The bibliography, of course, is one of the big things where we always see, and you'll see now in the example of my article that I'm going to use, that the bibliography is also quite often picked up. That is naturally a good thing, because it means that you are using, or your sources are being picked up. They are probably then also relatively legitimate, except if it's Wikipedia and Google. Although Google can be a good thing, and we'll talk about that if you want to. But going through your bibliography, seeing what it picks up is also a great exercise to see, okay, why is it not picking up this book? Did I put in the wrong information? Did I reference it incorrectly? Perhaps I gave the wrong title. So just checking through that as well is really a great way of making sure, okay, I see now that the sources that I use are recognized by the system. And if not, why not? Just to make sure also that your technique and that you're referencing and giving everything correctly, because it's not going to focus on your referencing technique, but on the words and the string of words and the way in which it's put into a sentence, such as here, you'll see Bosch, a DH in 1991, Transforming Mission, very popular book that's used all over the world and is highlighted in full here. But this is a false positive. No one would view this as plagiarism. Where we would perhaps be a bit skeptical is if your whole bibliography is exactly the same as someone else, because then someone might ask, but if you're a postgraduate researcher, shouldn't you be using other sources as well, be broadening your vision, be broadening your research? So if your bibliography is exactly the same as one other source, then you may want to ask yourself, perhaps I need to diversify just a little bit. Right, then you have subject and industry specific sources. So and I'm using an example here from the Bible, but this will go for any text that you have to use in your work. Because if it's subject or industry specific sources, there are no other ways to paraphrase that. If you need to use a policy, if you need to use the Bible, it has to be in that phrasing. So you can't get away from that being highlighted. But then you need to make sure, okay, did I reference it correctly? Did I make sure that, I've added my quotation marks, etc. And once again, I like the fact that this one was highlighted because it made the students stop, look at their quote here and see, why did it highlight? Oh, okay, it's highlighting because I'm using an industry-specific source, which in this case was the Bible. Then we can also look at terminologies and names. Once again, these are things that you really cannot change. I mean, I cannot change Desmond Tutu's name if that's what I'm using, Nelson Mandela's name. Just as an aside, I've had students who thought that they had to change the names of certain things. Now you can imagine that Holy Spirit, if they try and use a synonym for spirit, they often get words like rum or gin, and then it becomes the Holy Spirit. And then it gets a whole new meaning, and it's not what the intention was. And we try to explain, well, you can't change the name. If it's the Holy Spirit, if it's the National Youth Development Agency, then that is, in all honesty, going to pick up. It has to pick up. If Turnitin is not picking up that phrase or that acronym, then I would be worried that the algorithm is not doing its job. So if you are also really making, you're in your research, you're looking at a specific source, you're looking at a specific piece of work that uses a lot of this terminology and names, then it's going to be highlighted. At least it should. And that is fine. That's part of it. Then minor similarities will be picked up. In this case, you will see that it's picking up little strings of words all together, or even just the word the. We wouldn't view this, obviously, as plagiarism. It is picking up words similar, and also it's reading this whole sequence and saying, okay, well, I see now that this is similar to, in this case, the source that was purple. I can't see that far. Right. And then quotations. of course, we make use of quotations when we are postgraduate students. The fact of the matter is some seminal works can only really be effectively communicated, or the information or our argument can only really be effectively communicated if we make use of those seminal works. And quite often, we then need to have quotations. Quotations are great if they are needed and provide the needed gravitas to your arguments, but then you always need to make sure that you have referenced it correctly and that you have ensured that everything is according to your specific referencing code. So here you will see that it's highlighted in different colors, but this just means that there are, in this case, 3 specific quotes that it is picking up. And then this forces you to go and check, okay, what is it picking up? It's picking up a quotation mark. It's great if everything is highlighted. So I have to check, why are all the words not highlighted in this quote? Do I have quotation marks? And then also, just for some good measure, have I referenced it according to our referencing technique correctly? But quotations can also be problematic. You are coming with your own point of view, and although it may not be, strictly speaking, as we would view it, original, it is unique. And therefore, relying too much on quotations or quotes is problematic, because what you're in essence doing is making a summary. You are not, creating an argument. So in this case, this student, had a quote, everything fine and great, and did it relatively well. But this was a very short piece of work, and I've cropped this to fit into one little image. But this was basically a third of this one page, which we then said, well, despite the fact that you've referenced it correctly, despite the fact that this is a great quote to add, why so much of this? So quotes are wonderful, but they also need to be used within measure. And then what it will also pick up is if most words are similar. This often happens with us as researchers or as students when we are using one source to convey a certain principle or idea. So we haven't consolidated the different sources and their ideas or their ways of discussing this concept. So we make use of one source, and then we often take that, we make our notes, or we type it out, and we think we paraphrase. And what then happens in this case, what Turnitin picked up, was that, yes, okay, I can see the student tried to paraphrase, or at least tried to use some synonyms, but in essence, the gist of the argument is not the student's own and was not paraphrased sufficiently for me to say that this is the student's own understanding of this work. And this usually, to me, if I see this in my own work, I realize, okay, 2 things. I might not understand this concept as well as I thought I did. So I need to go back to the sources, and I need to go and make sure that I can explain this concept to my grandma, to Marlene, to my cat. Okay. Also, I need to make sure that I have read multiple sources and have consolidated these multiple sources' opinions and ideas into my argument, so that I'm not just relying, as you can see here, it's all in red, which means it's one source that is being picked up here. I'm relying too much on this one. So I should be branching out to my other sources and just checking that I am giving a broad idea. And then whole paragraphs that are similar. We really hope that this doesn't happen with us. Sometimes it does sneak in. In this case, it was intentional, as admitted by the student. I think with us as researchers, quite often we just don't always realize that our research practices might be lending itself to inadvertently writing down whole paragraphs that are extremely similar. If you see this in your work, go and check whether it's supposed to be a direct quote. Go and check whether you need this amount of direct quotation in your piece of work, and then also go and check that you've also referenced it correctly, and how can you rephrase this in a way that doesn't use such a big chunk of the main source. And then lastly, using your own work. So we spoke a little bit earlier about self-plagiarism and how we can also refer to it as text recycling. If it's done properly, it is text recycling, in my opinion. If it is done improperly, where you are just rehashing something that you wrote for 7 times in a row and giving it to a new journal as a new piece of work, then that is self-plagiarism. So it refers to the reuse of your own work, published work, or work that you get for grades or marks, without indicating in your work that this is, you are borrowing from yourself. You are borrowing from an idea that you had, albeit you had it, but many years ago. You are basing your current argument on that. So in this case, it was a student who had a master's and was doing their PhD, and huge chunks of their work was verbatim taken from their masters, without their, firstly, being a bit of a recontextualizing it for the current piece of work that they were doing, but secondly, also without referring to themselves. Now, I know that is extremely awkward. You don't want to have your name plastered everywhere, but you do need to refer to yourself and make sure that people are aware that this is based on work that you did previously, so that they can also go back and read that work and see whether they agree with your previous argument on which you're basing your current argument. Right, so we're going to look at an example. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to share, let me just share my screen with you. Kirshner, can you just indicate to me that you can see my Sunlearn dashboard?
It's loading at the moment. I'll tell you when it's ready.
Thank you.
Yeah, there we go.
Fantastic. So colleagues, what I'm going to do very quickly is I'm just going to go through what I've spoken about now and show you what it looks like in practice very quickly. I'm going to use one of my own articles and explain to you how can you try and use Turnitin in this fashion for your own research and you know, create a sandbox and check your reports and interpret your reports. Right. So many of you may be students, postgraduate students. If you are a lecturer at the university or a tutor who has gone through some Sunlearn training, then all of you will have access to an individual training course. So if you are a lecturer or if you are a tutor who has gone through Sunlearn training, please check whether you have access to your personalized training course. Because then for you, you can create your own Turnitin sandbox where you can go and continuously put your work or submit your work and go and check what is Turnitin picking up or not picking up and why, and what you can do to your research approach to ensure that you are really being being an ethical researcher. If you do not have a training course such as this one, and you are a lecturer, then you are more than welcome to log a ticket with the Learning Technologies support team. That's the old Sunlearn team, and they will help create one for you, or at least navigate you to the correct one. If you are a PhD student or a master's student, you don't have a training course, you're not a tutor, you're not a teaching assistant, etc., etc., you can ask your supervisor, for instance, to, on his training course, allow you access to that and create a link for you where you can then go and submit your work or your chapters as you're finished with them. And make an arrangement with the lecturer. I have an arrangement with my supervisor that when I'm done and I put it through, turn it in to see what comes back to me, I can then indicate to him, I have done that. Can he just check what he picks up? So you can make arrangements like that, but it's in that case up to the supervisor or someone else, another person with a training course, to give you access to that. Marlene and Kirshner and your librarians can also guide you to a sandbox that is created on the library website, and then you can also check with them what are the settings that they use so that you can also use that for your own research. So there are those options. Right, so in my training course, I'm just going to show you what I did. Is in my training course, I switch on my, or I make sure that my editing is set, is switched on, and I select the Turnitin assignment 2 activity. Right, I've given it a name, in this case, testing for plagiarism. I just usually, for myself, in the summary, I just say, you know, what are the settings that I'm going to use? I want to test for possible translation issues. So I'm keeping all settings open in this case. That's just for me. You don't have to put anything in there, but this just helps me to differentiate between my different sandboxes. Right, I indicate that I would like any submission type. You can add certain parts. So if I know you can have a maximum of 5 parts. So within one Turnitin link, it creates 5 separate little mini links where you can go and submit 5 chapters. Right, so, and you can also, if you set it up, you can also resubmit to that same link. We can talk a little bit about that if you like. Then I'd say I'd allow submission of any file type. I would say no, make sure, because we want to only use Microsoft Word in this case to ensure that it does not, it doesn't stop Turnitin from functioning properly. It has to do with macros, those of you who are familiar with that. Display similarity reports to students, because that's you, yes. And just generally, yes, automatically refresh similarity scores and grades. Right. Then here I set up my different little parts. I can call them part 1 or chapter 1, and I give them start dates and due dates. The important thing here to realize is that Turnitin passes with an R, an assignment, once, if you've set it up here, so to show grades automatically, and to ensure that, you know, the students can see their grades. You've set it there. Display similarity reports to student, yes. Okay, so they've submitted it, and you've set it up in such a way so that once submitted, the student gets a report to say, right, Magriet, you submitted 5 minutes ago, and you have a similarity score of 25%, go and check it out. Okay, but what it also does, Turnitin also does, is it resubmits that assignment or that submission on the due date. So then it's passed twice. And that's why we often find that if the class, or those of you who studied here in undergraduate, if your class ended, you'd submitted your assignment and you thought you had a 12% similarity score, and suddenly everyone in your class has submitted. Now it is checking on the due date your work for similarity against your peers, and you suddenly have 24% similarity and you don't know why. That is why. So for your sandbox for testing, I would say keep the due date and the start date close together so that you get an accurate view. It passes it then only once in effect. So you're not going to have a huge surprise in 15 days time where you see, oh, you know, this chapter has much more similarity and there are actually legitimate positive plagiarism scares there. Right, so that's the one thing to take into account. So keep your start date and your due date in your sandbox relatively close together to make sure you get the most accurate, up-to-date, immediate similarity score. You do this for each one of your assignment parts, or if you only have one link, then or one part, then that's what you do. And under similarity report options, you can now indicate for yourself, would you like to allow submissions after the due date? This is relatively arbitrary if you're using your own sandbox. Generate reports immediately. That's so that you can immediately see what Turnitin is spitting out for you. Or because this is your sandbox and you want, you know, you have set your date, your start date and your due date close together, you can say generate reports on due date. Okay. So in essence, what it then does, if you choose this option, it only passes it once. If you choose this option, generate reports immediately and students can resubmit until the due date, it means that it will pass the piece that you've submitted once, and then it will wait until the due date has come to pass it once more. Right, and then what you want to be cognizant of is this: the store student papers, you want to choose no repository. Because you are using this as a sandbox, as a testing base, you don't want your chapter that's unfinished to be added to the general, well, how much did we say, 1.8 billion sources available to other students. So you say no repository. Okay, so this is really important. This is so that it doesn't pick up in future a high similarity score or possible plagiarism because you submitted your unfinished work to Turnitin prematurely. And here you want to include check against stored student papers. You want to do that. You want to check against the internet. You want to check against journals, periodicals, and publications. You have the option to exclude the bibliography. You have the option to exclude quoted material. You have the option to exclude small matches of 3 to 4 words, for instance. I recommend that you do not change any of these settings. You don't exclude your bibliography. You don't exclude your quoted material. You don't exclude your small matches. Specifically, because you are trying to get a big picture of what your Turnitin is picking up in your research. And if you do put on too many filters and too many settings, then you may get a false negative. So you may think, I'm fine, it's not picking up anything. But that's because your settings might be too lax. These are the strictest settings that you could have in essence. So it's going to pick up everything. It's going to pick up false positives, and that's fine, because what you're going to do is you're going to go through your similarity report and you're going to check what it's picking up, and you're going to ask yourself, is this a quote? Am I quoting it correctly? Am I referencing correctly? You're going to go through it and say, okay, well, perhaps I didn't paraphrase. I should go and grapple with this argument a little bit more, but at least you're getting the full picture. So by the time you submit your final your final piece of work, there should be no surprises, or at least there should be no major surprises. And then what you get is this. So there we go. So this is an article that a few colleagues and I wrote together, and as we were writing, so we are 3 Afrikaans, our mother tongue is Afrikaans, and we are not, we are used to writing in English, but this was a theme that we had never written in English before. So we were quite aware that we had to paraphrase clearly. Otherwise, we would fall into the trap of, having too many similarities with the sources, because we didn't have the proper English vocabulary to really convey it. So it took us a lot of time to grapple with the information in a second language, and then come to a point where we could write down and say, okay, well, how much of this is really our own work? And we were very lucky in this instance that this is a theme that hasn't been written on quite a lot specifically. So you will see that it highlights, in this case, small similarities, and that we could ignore, because the phrase the end of the course is something that you can find that anywhere basically. But here also it picked it up, and we saw, okay, well, it's because it's a direct quote. Did I put it in my quotation marks? Yes. Am I quoting it correctly according to my reference? Yes. Why is it not highlighting that? Well, it's because the way in which we structured this quote, we needed to insert this word for it to make linguistic sense. So you will see that what it picked up mostly for us was direct quotes, and then a few of these, smaller put together bits. This one, for instance, came back from the reviewers saying it's too long, it's too much a part of your main argument, go and rephrase. And we did do that. So we felt we were quite lucky, because when I then look here, it shows me that my match overview is only 21%. Okay. And I'm not getting a lot of highlights. It may be because our theme is relatively niche, but it's also because we paraphrased we thought really well, but we also realized afterwards, after reading it and getting back from the reviewers, that just a lot of these resources weren't being picked up by Turnitin, but were being picked up by the reviewers. And so even though it wasn't present and shown on Turnitin, the reviewers could pick it up and could nudge us in the right direction to say, okay, this is actually, although the report comes back as 21, it's not too bad, and it doesn't look too bad, and a lot of it is your bibliography, as you see, our whole bibliography was highlighted here, then, at least we knew that, okay, Turnitin was not picking up everything that it was supposed to pick up. But also just to show you here, under this section, you can actually click on these links and view the match breakdown. So what you see here is a number 1. That's the number of the source. And it's in a color. The color actually does not matter. What matters is all of this is number 1, and this is what it's picking up. And it shows me that it's 11% in this case. So now what I can go and do is I can click on any one of these little broken down aspects. And if I say side by side, I can now see from the source, what is it picking up? There it's got the title, and where is it picking it up? So you can go and break down each of these little ones individually and go and see the sources yourself. So it's not just about going to look at this. For ons match overview, please. Okay. But it's about then going in and checking what is making that 11%, and then also going and checking each one of these and seeing, okay, why is it picking up this? What is it picking up? And then making sure that, and this takes time, please, this takes a lot of time. But in that way, you are sure. And the lovely thing about this one was we found so many resources that we didn't know existed and that we were inadvertently also relying on or using similar phrasing, which we could then go back to. So this is a very quick explanation of how to do it in practice. You are more than welcome to contact me if you wish to talk about your practice and how you use Turnitin and whether you use Turnitin or not. But that's just a quick explanation of how you should think about it and why you shouldn't be scared of it, but why you should also be critical of what Turnitin spits out for you. Right, that is my mouthful. I know we have a few minutes left. So Madeleine, I'm handing it over to you.
Magriet, there's quite a lot of questions. Can you see the chat box?
I can now see the chat box.
Okay, just browse through and see which of them you can answer no and maybe can come back now. We can go a bit over time, but just see there's quite a lot of questions.
So does the Stellenbosch license allow us to use it in instances where we're not submitting a paper? I'm not quite sure I understand that, but that question, but from what I understand from the question is that yes. So if you're not going to be submitting, so your lectures, this differs. So if you're an undergraduate student, make sure that that the lecture for which you're submitting an essay allows you to resubmit your essay multiple times. Otherwise, you are in essence going behind the back and getting a an Afrikaans would say a voorsprong. You're getting a jump that other students might not have because your lecturer doesn't actually want you to resubmit to Turnitin. But if it's something like a master's thesis or you're a postgraduate researcher and you're just testing as you are going along, so not necessarily with the view to publish necessarily, but in the future, then yes, you can do so. Quotations from a prescribed book or text. Firstly, I want to say the library's reference LibCal and LibGuide is amazing. So go and check it there. Yes, it's great that your lecturer has warned you about plagiarism. Part of that is paraphrasing, understanding your work, therefore, and also referencing. So I'll refer that to your friendly librarians. Yes, and Kirchner has also mentioned the Sandbox. When analyzing similarity, is there any way to turn off or deactivate these common similarities? Yes, so I showed you where you can say exclude bibliography if you so wished. But I would highly recommend that in your first few iterations, add everything. even if you get a lot of false positives, work through them, know what is being picked up and why. But yes, at the end, you can do so. My instance is preparing for exam, a junior that goes to Turnitin. I don't want to submit assignment that I prepare for exam that will be picked from a database of Turnitin and will penalize my exam because it has been used before. Yes. So if you are allowed, and in this case, once again, check with the lecturer what is allowed. If you are allowed to put your assignment or your essay for this exam through Turnitin before submitting it, if this is kind of a process writing where you can better yourself, then they could create for you a no repository link. Otherwise, you must just make very sure in the way in which you are writing this exam, apologies, that you are, if it's an essay type exam, that you are paraphrasing and following the guidelines with regards to referencing. Because yes, that is a fear, that if you've submitted it before, that it could be picked up. And then if it is picked up, you have to ask yourself why. Perhaps you have used too much of your previous work in this exam again. So yeah, do you have any recommendations? Writing theses, dissertations? Is it wise for me to submit every job, or should I rather submit to Turnitin on a needs basis? Right, so this depends on you. I am very unsure about my own writing proficiency, my language proficiency. Apologies. And so I like to use Turnitin after every chapter. Or if I'm struggling, to really find a way to, you know, give my idea, and I know that this piece that I've written is perhaps, yeah, not enough of my own conceptualization, then I like to put it in through Turnitin as ad hoc as well. So that depends on you. Get into a rhythm also with your supervisor, and I would highly recommend that you ask your supervisor if there aren't in your department any postgraduate sandboxes, but that you create one together and say, okay, I'm going to let you know once I've submitted my chapter, and then you can take a look at it on the Turnitin similarity report as well. So it depends on you. Find what works for you. It also depends on your context. If it is a science-based or STEM-based context, then doing it regularly might not be as beneficial as it would be for someone who's in the humanities. But find a rhythm that works for you, and find a rhythm that works for your supervisor, so that you don't expect of them to check every draft that you submit, but that you know, okay, they will check this draft or that draft. I hope that makes sense, Clarissa. So if you're borrowing from an assignment you submitted and it's not published, how do you reference yourself? Can I show an example? I don't have an example open in front of me as yet. This is something that you can also talk to your librarian specifically in your context about, because it's also very context specific. If you're mentioning an assignment that you've used in a previous year, I generally always told my students, don't refer to any of your unpublished essays from undergraduates. You may have been a fantastic writer, but you don't necessarily in that work have enough authority in that piece itself to base a larger argument. But discuss that with your librarian, discuss that with your lecturer or your supervisor, how they feel about you using unpublished, and I'm assuming undergraduates, assessments to form a part of your current argument. So I hope that makes sense. Oh, thanks, Alison. Okay. Francois, just to clarify, I've turned it in submission link on the mechanical engineering PhD standard module, but when I click on it, it doesn't take me to submission environment. Students that don't have direct access, and we have to go through our supervisor training platform. Francois, if you're still here, I'm going to motivate you to please contact me so that we can talk about that, because I can only really help you if I can check out what's going on there. Okay. So please, I'm going to give you guys my email. So please contact me with regards to that.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. Any benchmarks? Ooh, I love this question because it's also the most hated answer on the planet. No. We like the idea that when it is green, so the number of your similarity in the match overview, if it's green, under 15%, then that's fine. The fact is, something that is 0 and not being picked up at all by Turnitin should also bother you. And you also need to go and check, why is it not picking up sources? Why is it not picking up any of my quotes? Why is it not picking up any of my ideas or concepts? Can it be that I am this good an author? Can it be that I'm this original? Or is something going on with the algorithm or with the system? But someone who has 100%, it may be a glitch in the system. So no recommendation. Check it out. Be very diligent as a supervisor, not to dismiss something because it seems low or too high, but take the time to go through it. And it all depends on context. I've seen theology students who've gotten 75% similarity, but it's because of the nature of their research, and the jargon and the terms used, and the fact that it is a very little niche area. I've seen in economics, for instance, people who get 0, but in essence their entire economics argument is not their own whatsoever, but it wasn't picked up either. So no benchmark. It really depends on the context and the writing style and the theme, and yeah. So I know that's not the answer everyone wants to hear. I love it because it means it opens up a lot of opportunities. Apologies, people, there are hammering here. How can I delete the draft papers that I upload to Turnitin Sandbox? So no need to delete, Mr. Okiria, because it's not in if it's a sandbox, if it's no repository, I showed you that earlier and you can go and watch the recording again. If you've selected that, then no need for you to, apologies, to delete a draft, because that draft's not going to land anywhere. Okay. So you can resubmit then via that link as well, or resubmit via another link. But because it's not going to land in a repository, don't worry about it. Where you should be worried is if it's a standard repository, which means that it is going to take the work that you've submitted, it's going to swallow it up into the Turnitin system, and then it's going to be matched to other people's work, and other people's work is going to be matched to you. We can't delete that ourselves. So what you need to do in that case is you contact one of the learning support personnel. So it's the Sunlearn help desk, and you give them the ID number of that Turnitin, apologies, that Turnitin assignment. You tell them why you need to delete it. And also, if it's something that's already been graded or whatever, they're going to have some questions as to why does this need to be deleted. And then they will organize with Turnitin, because the whole idea is that you can't somewhere go and delete or remove your work from the main system once it is there. But in your case, Sandbox, don't worry, it's not going anywhere. It's just there for your own reflective pedagogical purposes. How can I get access to Turnitin? Mr. Amanful, so you can get access via your supervisor. If they would create a sandbox for you in their training course, you can go and get it, as Kirshner indicated previously in the chat. You can go and find one in the postgraduate office on their page. You can also find one on the library page. So contact those people involved, and they will be able to guide you in the right direction. And then a few years ago, I heard that Turnitin doesn't pick submissions in other languages. Is this still the case? Okay, that's a tricky question, Clarissa. A good one, but a tricky question. Right, so I mentioned that Turnitin works based on an algorithm. When we type, in Microsoft Word, any language, each letter in the alphabet, including other languages such as Greek or Russian that use other symbols, they are allocated a certain, and this is me, just very laypersoning and trying to explain myself, adding ones and zeros. So what the system sees then is not necessarily the language in which you put it through, but the ones and zeros that it reads. And therefore it can then, to a certain degree, translate or pick up similarities in other languages. At least that is what it is supposed to do. In my personal experience, I have seen people getting away with simply retranslating in Afrikaans and then submitting it. And because it was previously written only in English, it went through, it was a 0 on Turnitin, for instance, or it was a 5%. But in that case, almost every time the lecturer picked it up because the wording was incorrect, linguistically it just did not make sense, content didn't make sense. And part of this database is the more we add to it in other languages, the more it will also start to compare to that. And in essence, what it will then see is the Afrikaans word. It might not know it's Afrikaans, but it will see the text behind the text, the ones and zeros, and be able to match that then to similar wording in other languages, or at least that is the idea or how I understand it. So there are ways, but generally speaking, we have found that the larger this database has grown, the more different languages it is picking up and interlinguistically. But also lecturers who do pay attention or supervisors who do pay attention do pick up on the fact that this is simply a direct translation. And that's why it's really important that lecturers go through your reports and also through your assessments. Right. Yes, Prof. Nel, your accountants, we like measuring. Yeah, I actually worked with the School for Accountancy recently because it is very difficult to give you guys a benchmark because your work is so jargon and heavy and data specific. Right. I think Madeleine Kirchner, I think I've come to the end. Thank you very much for all of the positive feedback. And as Madeleine said, you're welcome to contact me. She will be able to also, if you can't remember who I am, Madeleine and Kirchner will be able to push you in my direction. So thank you so much for being here and being interested in learning about Turnitin. And please feel free to send me any questions that you may have.
Magriet, thank you so much. What is your email? It's Magriet.
So I'm mdev@sun.ac.za. I'm putting it in the chat.
mdev@sun.ac.za.
Yeah.
Thanks. There you are.
problem.
Yeah, you've done it as well. Magriet, so many thank yous. I know that you're such a wonderful speaker with such a lot of knowledge on this topic, and I could see from the comments that you did well today. So thank you very much for your time being. I know that you are so busy, and thank you for offering that students can contact or researchers can contact you directly. That's a positive. So good luck for the rest of the day, and thank you very much. And goodbye to everybody.
Thanks so much, Madeleine and Kirchner. And yeah, thanks everyone. Please reach out if you have any questions. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.